Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd. It's my joy to continue our chronological study of the Scriptures by today, beginning with Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2. I've titled the devotional, God Remembered Israel. I do invite you to open your Bible with me to Exodus chapter 1. And subtopic of this chapter would be the 12 tribes of Israel in Egypt. Now, verses 1 through 7, God had blessed Israel. And yet a change in leadership can be perilous. Whether it's an institution, a corporation, a nation, inexperienced leadership and a lack of appreciation for legacy and history will invariably lead to detrimental decisions and course changes. Egypt was no different. And that certainly is the rule that I have seen throughout my lifetime, whether it's a change of pastors of churches or principals of schools or presidents of colleges or seminaries. I've noticed over the years the most dangerous time in an institution, in a nation, is the time when leadership has changed. So, as you come to Exodus chapter 1, we are introduced to a change. And so you'll notice in the opening verses, we read, Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation, and there arose up a new king, a new Pharaoh over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Exodus 1, 6, and 8. Now remember, Joseph had been a gifted administrator, and God blessed his rise to power in Egypt. He became second only to Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 41. He truly was God's man for the hour, and the tribes of Israel prospered under his care even long after his death. Exodus 1 and verse 7. And yet, as we come to verses 8 through 14, we find a growing resentment of the Egyptians toward the Israelites. So notice then, if you would, how Israel was oppressed and enslaved by Egypt. And so when we read that a new Pharaoh did not know Joseph in verse 8, we understand he was ignorant, that is the new Pharaoh, he was ignorant of Joseph's legacies and the policies that had made Egypt prosper. Instead, the new king instituted his policies and not those of the former leader. Pharaoh became concerned, though, about the population growth of the children of Israel and believed that it threatened the nation, verses 9 and 10. And therefore, the king of Egypt issued a series of commands to limit the population growth of Israel and tasked the people with heavy burdens and hardships, verses 11 through 14. You'll notice in verses 15 through 22, Pharaoh's command to murder Israel's infant sons. Now, the king ordered the genocide of the sons born of Hebrew women in verses 15 through 21. However, the midwives feared God, we read, and they did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they saved the men, children alive, that is, the sons born to Hebrew mothers in verse 17. Well, rather than restricting the population of Israel, we read in verse 20 that Israel, the people, multiplied and they waxed very mighty. And then finally, in verse 22, Pharaoh demanded the drowning of every son born of a Hebrew mother. Now, some might ask, why? Why would God allow his people, his chosen ones, to suffer such calamity? And I would suggest that the sufferings and the sorrows the people of Israel faced were part of God's plan. Now, the Lord intended to move his people from the comfort and the riches of Egypt to Canaan, the land that he had covenanted to give the descendants of Abraham. Now that brings us to Exodus 2. And here we have recorded the birth of Moses, verses 1 through 4. Now, Exodus 2 does introduce us to Moses. Now, he is a man that we know by looking back was destined to be one of the great leaders in human history. Now, though the tribes of Israel prospered in Joseph's lifetime, the years of plenty had become a distant memory when Moses was born. Now, the children of Israel were by that time slaves of Egypt, and Moses was born in a slave's household and under the threat of infanticide, that is, the death of all the infants. And providentially, Moses' parents were pious believers of the priestly tribe of Levi. Now, his mother, Jochebed, risked her life, and we read in verse 2 of chapter 2 that she hid Moses 3 months after his birth. She eventually made a vessel of reeds, placed her son in the basket, and we read that she set him adrift on the Nile River, entrusting his life, the life of her son, to God's providential care. And then verses 5 through 10, we have recorded God's preparations of Moses to lead Israel. And so we're reminded that God is sovereign. And so as the infant Moses drifted from his mother to where Pharaoh's daughter was bathing, his cry pierced the heart of the princess, and Moses became the object of her favoring compassion. She realized that the baby boy was a Hebrew, and the suggestion of Moses' sister, Pharaoh's daughter, employed Jochebed, his mother, to be his nurse. In the providence of God, Moses spent the first 40 years of his life in the palace as a son of Pharaoh's daughter, and therefore a prince of Egypt. As a result, he was favored, not only with the finest education of his day, but he became a leader who was mighty in words and in deeds. Verse 10. So here is a young man growing up in the house of Pharaoh. He speaks with authority, and he conducts himself in a mighty way. Perhaps that is a reference to even war, studying. He became quite the architect, it would seem, later on, knowing how to build the tabernacle. So a very interesting man trained in Pharaoh's house. Now, we find Moses' affection for Israel, however, beginning in verse 11 through 25, and ultimately his flight to the wilderness. And so despite his Egyptian facade, that is, the outward presence and appearance of Moses was that of an Egyptian, we read, however, in verses 11 through 15, that the heart of Moses was knit with the suffering of the Hebrew people. And finally, the abuse suffered by Israel so incensed Moses that we read that he took the life of an Egyptian. Now, understanding that Pharaoh would soon know his crime, Moses fled into the wilderness, and there he would spend the next 40 years of his life, verses 16 through 22. Now, in God's providence, Moses, the son of Pharaoh's daughter, assumed the lowly role of a hireling shepherd to a Midianite man named Reuel. Now, he would later be known as Jethro. Now, the once proud prince of Egypt was content to dwell with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to be Moses' wife. Now, Zipporah gave birth to 2 sons of Moses, Gershon in chapter 2 and verse 22, and later Eleazar, chapter 18 and verse 4. Well, a closing thought for this first of several devotionals from the book of Exodus. In their sorrows, back in Egypt now, the children of Israel began to cry out to God. And we read, and I quote, "He heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob." Verse 23 and 24. God remembered Israel, and he had not forgotten Moses. In our next study, we're going to find where God finds Moses in the wilderness and how he was prepared to lead a nation. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of this new study in the book of Exodus. And bye-bye.